Within Shattered Legacies, there is a topic that I really want to start talking about, this being the Ruin War. However, before we can get to that, we need to cover many different individuals. That way you kind of get an idea of everything that is going on. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about one of the most important characters during the Ruin War itself, and probably one of the most important characters in Shattered Legacies as a whole. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the supreme god of creation, Zack Jackson. As I've said before, Shattered Legacies doesn't really have a main character. The main character is largely each of the primary factions, as it's Shattered Legacies is more focused on those primary factions. But of course, you have all of the little different characters that mean a lot, and the character that comes the closest to being a main character, a protagonist, is Zack Jackson himself. Now, an important thing that we need to discuss is the fact that Zack Jackson isn't just one person. The name Zack Jackson is a title, an honorific title due to the original Zack Jackson from the origin race, otherwise known as the Oroton. As a result of the actions that he chose to take, the name Zack Jackson has become an honorific title rather than a name, and as a result, the person who pledges to defend all of reality is the person who takes it. They essentially abandon their former name and take up the name Zack Jackson. That being said, we need to remember that each Zack Jackson is wholly unique. As a result, each one has their own individual title, such as the very first Zack Jackson from the Oroton race known as Origin, whose real name was Zack Jackson, hence the title. In today's episode, we're going to specifically be talking about Legend, as his name is, well, he was a legendary individual. We'll leave it at that. A lot of his old lore has been retconned. We'll probably still go over it as a whole, but we're largely going to be going over who he is, some of the struggles that he's gone through, as well as more specifically, a real in-depth dive into his divine weapon, Tenjai Kuroga. So, who is Zack Jackson? Well, he's... how do I best describe his personality? He has a complex personality between oftentimes appearing to not really give a shit, but that's largely because he's been around for so long that if he cares about every single little detail that people have, he's never going to get anything done. I wouldn't say that he's necessarily apathetic, though. He definitely has a... he's kind of like Goku from Dragon Ball Z, but without the goofiness, you know? Like, in one of the episodes of Dragon Ball Z, Goku had claimed that he's no hero of justice. Zack is kind of the same way, or at least Legend is kind of the same way. He's not a hero of justice. He's doing what he has to do. Because the interesting thing is that every single Zack Jackson chose to become the defender of reality, whereas Legend, it was kind of forced upon him. This is due to old retconned lore, how the old greater god of creation and destruction, who was basically a, shall we say, a proxy to the supreme gods, which at the time didn't exist, their body had been destroyed, and they required a temporary vessel until such time as their body could be restored. Turns out that the individual who would later become the legendary Jackson was the perfect vessel. Keep in mind, this is all retconned lore. This isn't canon anymore, but I don't really have a canon background, so we're just going to go with the old retconned lore. As a result, a lot of various different things happened, including something known as the Cyrus Project, which we might go over. We probably won't, though, because like I said, old retconned lore. Eventually, the people that he was kind of journeying around with realized that there was a god inside of him. And of course, the god, not wanting Legend to know that he was in there because it might destroy his mind, basically tried to communicate with them, even though Legend kind of knew anyway. The very first instance of his divine weapon was known as the Golden Blade. And it was basically like, Think StarCraft Protoss, the zealots, the like blue energy waves that come out from their gauntlets. It's kind of a similar thing, only enveloped his entire hand, and he used it as a pseudo melee weapon. Obviously, it wasn't particularly good, and this was only the very first instance of Tenjai Kuroga, because back then it was still in an incompleted state due to an ancient war that caused it to be heavily damaged. So essentially, the entire time it was with Legend at that time, it was slowly healing, shall we say. I wouldn't say repairing itself, but if the shoe fits. Eventually, Legend decided that he was going to go toe-to-toe with a couple of gods because they were causing a whole lot of problems at the area that he was at. Now, in the old retconned lore, Legend has died many times, and each time he gained a form of amnesia, not remembering details of the past. And as a result, this caused Tenjai Kuroga to take longer and longer to reform and heal itself, because every single time Legend died, Tenjai Kuroga resurrected him. Now that sounds like it's a fantastic thing, but you'll see real quickly that it's not. So anyway, Legend went toe-to-toe with some gods. Keep in mind, he's still immortal at this point, which means he can't kill the gods, but he certainly did try, and he beat the holy hell out of them. Eventually, he did something that is an absolute impossibility. A mortal gained divine power, the power of the gods, through his own determination. Now, I don't remember if we had talked about it, but divinity is essentially the essence of the gods. It's what they primarily use to do all of the various different things that affect reality, dependent on their aspect. An aspect is basically, this god is in charge of this concept, like the god of humanity. Do they actually influence anything that humanity does? No, largely not really, but their job is to ensure that humanity stays on a very specific course that allows for a lot of leeway and making sure that the race doesn't go extinct. That's their job. You know, let's say the god has the aspect of water. Their job is to ensure that water exists. That's really about it. Some of them are super benign and general, whereas some of them can be incredibly specific. Then, of course, you get to more and more important aspects until you get to what are known as the vital aspects. These vital aspects are essentially, reality cannot exist without these. In some way, shape, or form, these have to exist. These being creation, destruction, time, magic, and a few others. But that's not the point of this topic. So, divinity fuels the aspect of a god and allows them to perform their various different tasks. Now, divinity itself is highly, highly toxic to mortals. Now, when we had talked about the vital essences of life, we had talked about that there are 5. There is physical capabilities, or stamina-based capabilities. There is magic, there is psionics, there is life force, and then there is divinity. All mortals have divinity in their body, but it's such an inconsequential amount that the body basically ignores that it exists. But it is there. This is why any mortal being that is chosen by a god can rise to divinity. They can become a god, but they still require the selection from a god. You know, they can't just be flooded with divinity, because the way that divinity works in the mortal body is a mortal body becomes obsessed with divinity, but it can't process divinity. But it tries to process it in so many different ways that it exhausts the body's entire, energy. It'll use every single drop of energy to try and process divinity, which means that it's taking energy from more vital locations, such as the organs, to make sure that they're still running, and the body will literally try to process divinity to its own death. Now, in normal biology, the body would not work like this. The body would do everything it can to survive, rather than slowly kill itself off because it's trying to figure out how to deal with divinity. But regardless, so This was really shocking to almost every single god. Legend had attained godhood. He had become a god. He has divinity. And nobody's really sure how he did this. He wasn't selected by any god. The god of creation and destruction that was in his body never selected him to become a god. He was just a mortal that was literally nothing else than basically the god's backpack. That's not a good way of putting it. You know, like the god inhabited his body but had no interest in raising Legend to divinity or anything like that. So it really called into question how exactly Legend had done this. How did Legend become a god when he hadn't been chosen by anybody? Well, the fact of the matter is we have no clue. Nobody knows. Gods have been researching it for longer than I can even describe, because the important thing about reality is that it goes through something known as creation cycles. And a creation cycle is basically the start of reality to the end of reality. Everything in between those two very specific points is a creation cycle. And so when reality ends, a god will come along, a very special god will come along, and they'll basically recreate reality, start a new creation cycle. And creation cycles can easily last. Think about how long it would take for reality in the real world to kind of go from the point in which it started to the point in which it dies out completely. It is eons. Eons upon eons upon eons. So much time that I doubt there's anybody alive that could put a quantifiable number to how long reality will survive. It will persist, you know? And let's say there was an old theory. I don't think it applies in science anymore, but there was an old theory that basically there was the Big Bang, where everything was created, everything exploded outwards in every single direction, and that eventually it would reach a tipping point, and the total gravity of the universe would kind of draw everything back in on itself, and it would basically compact itself back down into a singularity and create another Big Bang. It's a situation similar to that. Now, in modern science, I don't think that's followed anymore, but we're not here for science. We're not here for real science. So, as a result, we can't really give an age to Legend, because he has survived so many creation cycles that we can't even, again, he's been through so many creation cycles, which are so long you can't justifiably put a number to them, that we don't know the exact number. We can basically just say he's lived for an infinite amount of time, because at this point, he might as well have lived for an infinite amount of time. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The main purpose of this was simply to say that gods have been researching why Legend was capable of becoming a god for so long that, again, we can't put a quantifiable number to it. But anyway, we're moving on. And it was only when Legend became a greater god that he unlocked his divine weapon, Tenjai Kuroga, which is by far one of the most powerful divine weapons. Now, Tenjai Kuroga has 4 parts to its name, which means it's a first-generation divine weapon created by Tesha. First-generation divine weapons are fucking absurdly powerful. I wouldn't say that Tenjai Kuroga is the most powerful first generation divine weapon, but it's certainly it's up there. It's powerful as hell. Now, of course, this is going to be a massive word salad, because I don't think any of these are actually words. What is Tenjai Kuroga's full name? Well, to answer that question, it is Tenjai Kuroga Mibashi Renjai. Once again, like I said before in the Divine Weapon episode, don't ask me where the hell I thought these names up. I have no idea. And honestly, this could be like some foreign language. Like, there could be a few words in these divine weapons that are like Asian, and I have like an Asian language, and I have no idea. I literally it popped up in my head, and I was like, yeah, that makes sense. So we're going to cover Tenjai Kuroga itself, and then we'll kind of get back into Legend. So, Tenjai Kuroga is known as the Blade of Infinite Multiplication. When we talked about divine weapons, I kind of touched on this, how When Tenjai Kuroga is at its most powerful, which it's only ever been able to achieve like 2 or 3 times, it's capable of safely multiplying the power of its master by an infinite amount, whether this be physical capabilities, magic, psionics, or divinity, because life force can't be interacted with. So if it's one of those 4, it can infinitely multiply it. However, like I said, there's only 3 or 4 times that it's ever been at full power, and these were very, very specific circumstances. The majority of the time, Tenjai Kuroga can only double. Very rarely it can triple, which is still an astonishing amount of power. Like, if you're an Omni and you double your power, you could probably get halfway to the power of a deity. Like, it's quite the massive power-up. Now, Tenjai Kuroga itself is a broadsword. However, the broadsword itself is segmented. The entire length of the blade is segmented with elastic strands in between each of the segments. Essentially, it's a whip blade. The blade can elongate itself and act like a whip with obviously serrated edges, as each segment of the blade is still incredibly sharp. However, it's also capable of maintaining a standard broadsword rather than elongating. How exactly this is controlled is largely believed to be a connection between the divine weapon and its master, but it's never been fully confirmed. As there are times where Legend will throw the blade out, like swing the blade out, and it should very obviously elongate as a whip blade, but it just maintains a standard broadsword. Now, when it comes to divine weapons, some of them are capable of granting abilities, special abilities or attacks that are unique solely to the divine weapon. If you don't have the divine weapon, you literally cannot use it, no matter who you are, with the exception of maybe Tesha, because he's the one who made the damn abilities. Tenjai Kuroga allows access to 2 series of attacks, these being the Valka series and the Zistaunia series. Now, Zistaunia is essentially, think Dragon Ball Z and the Kamehameha. That's what the Zistaunia is. It's basically an energy beam that can be fired up. There are multiple different levels of it that increase its overall powers and capabilities. Whereas the Valka series is essentially, in terms of a video game, it's a buff. It allows various different buffs to occur to Legend that empower him in multiple different ways. Some of them are just increasing his overall output of any of his 4 vital essences, again, that being physical capabilities, magic, psionics, or divinity. Sometimes it makes him more agile. There's actually one known as Valka Doma, which literally, it forces Legend to abandon all defenses. He cannot block, he cannot parry, he cannot sidestep. He has to charge forward, putting every single ounce of his remaining energy into an attack, which obviously is a huge gamble and can majorly fuck you up if you don't use it at the right time. But of course, let's get back to Tenjai Kuroga itself. Now, when it comes to first generation divine weapons, you oftentimes learn each part of the name gradually. You know, you immediately learn the first part of its name, which for Tenjai Kuroga was a bit unique because when Legend first discovered Tenjai Kuroga, it said that its name was Tenjai Kuroga. Now, obviously, that is 2 parts of its name. So why didn't it just say Tenja? Well, actually, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. So when it comes to first generation divine weapons, each segment of its name that you learn unlocks a new transformation. It's capable of transforming depending on how many parts you speak out loud, and this allows for a multitude of various different benefits, boons, and abilities. Normally, when you unlock a first generation divine weapon, you only get the first part. You get the most basic transformation that it is capable of undertaking. You know, it's basically like, this is its natural state. And then as you say more and more parts to its name, it becomes more and more powerful. It transforms each and every single time to become either more specific on a specific aspect or just capable of more abilities, capable of just further increasing your own abilities. The possibilities are literally endless because of the fact that these are first generation divine weapons. Tenjai Kuroga is unique in that when Legend unlocked the divine weapon, he received the first 2 parts of the name, which is considered to be its most basic form rather than its first transformation. Again, nobody's entirely sure why Tenjai Kuroga works like this, and in fact, simply saying Tenjai is its final transformation. However, for whatever reason, Legend never elaborated as to why, it is completely and utterly forbidden to use just Tenjai rather than Tenjai Kuroga or any of its other 2 transformations. It's widely believed that it's because the power that just Tenjai alone provides is so insane that Legend largely cannot control it, which is a possibility, but it's never been confirmed. Within Shattered Legacies, Legend has only ever used Tenjai twice, and both times there were no witnesses, because it was literally him going against the big evil bad guy on a 1v1 mano-a-mano, and he's the only one that walked away. What it does, only Legend is really sure, but he basically uses it as like, this is literally a last resort. You know, this is the last resort. If none of my other last resorts work, I will use Tenjai. Otherwise, I refuse to use it. But so, Tenjai Kuroga in its most basic state, that being Tenjai Kuroga, is a broadsword, specifically a whip blade. However, once again, Tenjai Kuroga is by far one of the most unique because typically when a divine weapon or a first generation transforms, it's some enhanced form of the previous state. The only one that doesn't abide by this is Keiichi Mitsubaisha, whose basic form I believe is a bastard sword and then goes to a sickle. But by and large, first generation divine weapons, it'll have its basic form, and then its first transformation is basically an improvement on that basic form, you know? But with Tenjai Kuroga, it's completely all over the place. Each transformation is vastly and wildly different. Now let's go on to its first transformation, this being Tenjai Kuroga Mibashi. In the Mibashi transformation, the broadsword literally dissolves in Legend's hand, and a solid metal bar, roughly 2 feet long, appears floating behind his back. This then segments into 8 equally long or equally wide pieces that fan out in a circle behind his back, similar to kind of like a halo. Then a bright flash of light will occur, and each of these small iron bars will turn into individual blades. Now, you may question, how is this useful? Well, this is useful because each and every single one of these 16 blades is capable of flying as well as independently targeting and attacking enemies of Legend without him having to even register that specific blade exists. Furthermore, if the blades are to enter his hand and he goes into melee combat himself, his overall physical prowess is spiked by an enormous amount. So basically, Legend can literally just activate Mibashi and just stand on the battlefield while his enemy is overwhelmed by 16 blades flying in every single direction. Furthermore, the blades are capable of coming together and creating essentially a solid wall, a solid circular wall directly in front of Legend that is capable of defending him from any attack. Usually he only uses all 16 when it's a particularly nasty one. Otherwise, he usually just uses 2 blades in an X shape to defend himself. Now, obviously, this sounds like it'd be incredibly useful, which It should be noted that these blades aren't whip blades. They're not really broadswords either. They're significantly long. Well, maybe not significantly longer, but they are longer, almost to the level of a great sword, but not quite. It's like a middle ground between the two. And they're far thinner than the basic form. Plus, they're capable of independent flight and attacking. Now we get to Tenjai Kuroga Mibashi Renjai. The Renjai transformation is vastly different, and essentially it turns into this massive giant, like in some fantasy settings, a character will have a great sword, but it's not what a real great sword looks like. A real great sword is basically a broadsword but longer. It's very thin. What is it? I think European blades are primarily designed for stabbing rather than slashing. I mean, they can still do slashing, obviously, but they're primarily designed for stabbing, I believe. I'm not a sword expert, so. But, going back to what I was saying, in some fantasies, like, the Final Fantasy, I forget which one it is, but, Cloud's Buster Sword, or whatever the hell it's called. How the blade is just fucking massive. Those types of weapons don't actually exist because they're far too unwieldy in order to actually use in battle. The same with, like, warhammers just being this basically, like, cinder block on top of a stick. No, that's not what warhammers actually look like. Warhammers are literally, they're like the size of a construction hammer on a very long arm. And it's literally like, it's basically a spear with a construction hammer head on the top. That's basically what it is. You just go bonk, and it's designed to break through armor. Now, obviously, again, fantasy kind of goes insane sometimes. So you have warhammers that are, like I said, literally a cinder block on a stick. And then, more specifically, you have great swords that are just insanely massive. And you look at it and it's like, there's no way that you should be able to swing that around. That's kind of what the Renjai transformation looks like, only it's a half circle. It's a half circle with the entire outer edge bladed, and then at the very center, there is a handle that Legend can hold. And he can literally whip this thing out and throw it like a boomerang, and it will just cleave through everything and return back to him. And furthermore, he's even capable of breaking it in half to use as basically two giant ass blades that he can then swing around. And the reason why Tenjai Kuroga is so unique is because in Shattered Legacies, there are 3 primary ways of fighting. And then there are more heavily defined forms of fighting that branch off of these 3 primary. These 3 primaries are agility-focused, physical-focused, and mystic-focused. Agility is obviously as it sounds, attacking as fast and as frequently as you possibly can. This is what the Mibashi transformation is. It is literally 16 blades that are constantly onslaughting the enemy. It is an agility-focused transformation. Then we have Renjai, which is a giant fucking blade, half-moon blade, where it's literally designed as a physical combat style. It is incredibly heavy. It is more focused on using physical strength to literally crush and dominate your opponents. Actually, no, I got those wrong. The Mibashi is a mystic transformation because the blades are autonomously attacking. Its basic form, Tenjai Kuroga, is the agility because it's a whip blade. It's capable of lashing out very quickly and continuously. And Tenjai Kuroga is really the only one that does this. Every single divine weapon, regardless of its generation, it is always focused on one method of attack. It's either agility-focused, mystic-focused, or strength-focused. I was going to say physical, but strength makes more sense. It's always one of these 3. And Tenjai Kuroga is the only one that transforms between each of these 3 different combat styles, which makes it incredibly unique, as if it wasn't unique enough. The final thing I have to say about Tenjai Kuroga is it's the only divine weapon that can resurrect its wielder. And this is due to the fact that the original purpose of Tenjai Kuroga when Tesha had created it was to dominate the aspect of death. It quite literally, basically, the Grim Reaper can walk up and Tenjai Kuroga basically just shoves him away. Not today, Grim Reaper, you're not taking this soul. And basically, it sacrifices its own power, its own capabilities in order to constantly resurrect its master. Now, of course, you will obviously question the logistics of this as well as the intelligence of this. If you're literally making yourself weaker, wouldn't it be smarter to literally let your master die? That way you can get a new one and you can provide even further assistance to them. Well, Tenjai Kuroga, like its master, Legend, is completely and utterly batshit insane. And I'll get to why Legend is insane, but Tenjai Kuroga has been around for a very long time, and it was specifically its previous master was a Demon King. And we've talked about the Demon Kings and the Demon Legion before, but basically it was owned by a Demon King, and it just caused mass slaughter of everything, and it was because of this just mindless, savage, brutal slaughter that it was constantly inflicted upon it. It basically just lost all semblance of sanity. Now, divine weapons can actually speak with their masters, and in very rare situations, they can even take a physical form in order to speak with others. And when you hear, if you ever hear Tenjai Kuroga talk, he doesn't sound insane. You know, he's not like, it's not like somebody that's in an insane asylum, you know? He talks normally, like a normal person, like I'm currently talking right now. You know, he sounds very mentally stable despite the fact that he has gone completely and utterly insane. And you can kind of tell this by some of the ways that he acts, you know? Whereas, like, Tenjai Kuroga was put through so much bloodshed that he has basically complete and utter apathy towards anything that his master is fighting. Even if that enemy that his master is fighting is a friend, he has complete and utter apathy. He does not care anymore, you know? And like, when he's not in battle, again, that apathy kind of shows how he doesn't really give a damn about anybody else other than his master. That's the only person that matters to Tenjai Kuroga at this point, which is why Tenjai Kuroga has this sort of obsession with keeping Legend alive no matter what. Now, unfortunately, this has cost Tenjai Kuroga a lot of power, and it's one of the reasons why Tenjai Kuroga can no longer infinitely multiply Legend's power, because it has resurrected him so many times, again, without Legend's knowledge, because he was still immortal. He didn't have the memory-keeping capabilities of a god. So every single time he died, he would be resurrected at a different time, at a different location, with total amnesia. Irreversible amnesia. He couldn't recover from it. He would never remember anything. He just has amnesia. He has no idea where he is. He still has all of his same capabilities, because Tenjai Kuroga is still there technically with him, despite he still only had the golden blade. Regardless, you know. And it was only after Legend became a god and started dying as a god that he started to remember each time he died, and he was like, oh, wow, something is going on here. Either I'm anomalous, which Legend technically is anomalous, or there's some outside factor that is resurrecting me every single time. Turns out it was his divine weapon. So anyway, let's go on to why Legend is insane. The reason is a lot more simple than Tenjai Kuroga's, and that is time. The amount of time that Legend has lived. Now, in real life, there are some people who wish that they had immortality, and I am one of them. I have thanatophobia in real life, which is death anxiety. The idea of immortality is very appealing to me because I don't want to die, but obviously I'm going to eventually, and that's kind of a fact that I kind of have to deal with. But we're not here about my thanatophobia. The problem with immortality is time. You know, And it's something that a lot of various different mediums have brought up. We are mortals. We have mortal minds. And as a result, when we live longer than our species' life expectancy, if that's even a thing that can happen in the real world, you eventually run out of things to do. Like a lot of different animes and stuff like that have brought up the fact that there are specific things that just kind of become meaningless. Like pursuing relationships. They become meaningless because if you're immortal, but the person that you're dating isn't immortal, they're eventually going to die, and you're going to keep on going and going and going to the ends of time, So certain things like that become completely meaningless, And as a result, it's specifically 40k Necrons. They suffer with this very same thing. And I believe it was Trazyn the Infinite that had brought up, we need to have an overarching goal. For some Necrons, that is the conquering of the entire known universe. Imatech the Stormlord is one of them. Whereas Trazyn's is his archive on Solemnes. They need an obsession. They need something to keep their minds occupied as they go on through the eons that they are going to continue to live through. And it's a very similar thing with mortal beings. The Necrons have it a little bit easier, but not by much. When it comes to mortal beings, you need to have something to entertain yourself. Now, Legend obviously had plenty of things to entertain himself with, but eventually, even when you have things that occupy your mind, when you live for as long as Legend has, your mind starts to degrade. And the longer you live, the worse it gets, until you get to a point where your mind is basically completely and utterly insane by its very nature, because mortal minds weren't meant to live as long as Legend has. And again, it's much like Tenjai Kuroga. You talk with him, and he doesn't sound like he's insane, but he is. And it's one of the reasons why, in another episode, when we get to the Cursed Blade Madra, we'll see that he's not really affected by things that would drive other people insane, because again, he's already insane. He's already mentally unstable to the point where it's basically irreversible and you can't fix it. You can't change it. And so as a result, he has the same level of apathy that Tenjai Kuroga has. Now, obviously, if you go insane, it's not just, I am now apathetic towards everything. No, but that's specifically how Tenjai Kuroga and Legend manages to cope with their insanity. They just basically become apathetic to everything that's around them. Now, obviously, there are still things that are important to them. With Tenjai Kuroga, it's Legend. So long as Legend is okay, Tenjai Kuroga is fine. With Legend, oddly enough, it was the Siritan Empire. For a long time, he was the Siritan Emperor until he ended up dying fully in the Ruin War. But of course, that brings up another thing. How does Legend die? He's a god now, which means that whatever he fought against had to have been greater than a supreme god, which is already insane as in of itself. But again, even when Legend has died, Tenjai Kuroga always resurrects him. So what in the hell happened there? Well, you're going to have to wait until the Ruin War episode to figure that little tidbit out. But again, this brings up the talk that I was going to, or the thing I was going to talk about, is that Legend is a god now. His soul is, or his mind is still the mind of a mortal. So he's still insane. But his soul has become the soul of a god, which means that his soul is capable of persisting outside of his body. So even if his body is destroyed, he can still live. And even if his soul is destroyed, Tenjai Kuroga will resurrect him, because Tenjai Kuroga is capable of that. But of course, there are specific situations that are capable of actually outright killing Legend. All of them have been temporary because each one is dependent on a very specific circumstance. So, this is now not long before the Ruin War. Legend has been around for so goddamn long that one important thing to always remember about Legend is that he's tired. Not like he's tired because he hasn't gotten enough sleep, but he's tired because he is a mortal mind who has lived for longer than even most gods have lived. And he's tired. He's just sick of it all. And he's honestly reached the point where he just wants to die. Not because he's suicidal or anything, but he's lived for so long that he deserves his rest type of situation, you know? And he can't because Tenjai Kuroga keeps on resurrecting him. So he did a little something something that normally is impossible. How Legend did it is unknown. He broke a small fragment off of Tenjai Kuroga and gave it to his son, Yandril, and gave him explicit orders. No matter what happens, no matter how bad the situation gets, keep this fragment away from Tenjai Kuroga. And what it did is it essentially severed that resurrection. It's not that the resurrection capabilities of Tenjai Kuroga were in that sliver that was given to his son Yandril. It was more, Tenjai Kuroga isn't whole anymore. So it's not capable of using that ability anymore. And that was the purpose of it. And the Legend actually ended up dying permanently at that point. Eventually, a little something something known as the Ruin War decided to rear its ugly head. And not long before it actually went off, Yandril returned the sliver to Tenjai Kuroga. The interesting thing is that when a divine weapon's master ends up completely dying, the divine weapon re-enters the cycle, which is, for lack of a better term, we'll call it the divine weapon cycle, where basically its master has died, it will go into some non-existent ethereal location, and it will be assigned to a new master. And then it's up to the master to unlock the divine weapon's conditions, whatever those may be, and then gain access to the divine weapon. For a divine weapon to persist without its master is unheard of. Somehow Tenjai Kuroga was capable of doing it, and it's theorized that it's because Tenjai Kuroga wasn't whole anymore. It had that sliver missing from itself. So it literally, they put Legend's body in a tomb, and they placed Tenjai Kuroga on top of the tomb, just sitting there. Now, I don't even want to know what mental ramifications this would have to Tenjai Kuroga. It probably went even more insane, if I'm being honest. Legend stayed dead for a very long time, and he was actually legitimately dead. But eventually, like I said, the oncoming of the Ruin War was starting to become more noticeable, and Yandril returned the sliver to Tenjai Kuroga, at which point it immediately worked his magic and resurrected Legend. Much to Legend's annoyance, but then he saw what the fuck was happening. It was like, yeah, okay, I don't blame you a lot, Yandril. Yeah, you should have brought me back to life. And then he just ends up dying anyway, so, you know. But, so, let's see. Let's go over a few of his achievements. Obviously, there is the biggest achievement that primarily earned him the title of Legend, which was the fact that he ended up becoming a god without the approval of any god. Again, how he did this, no god's really sure, and a lot of gods point to the fact that Legend is probably anomalous. Now, we've talked about anomalies before. You can essentially think of the SCP universe. You know, anomalies are something that are not natural to reality. They defy the laws of reality, which, to be fair, there are individuals who have defied the laws of reality, but existing in a natural state that defies the laws of reality and nature. It is not something that is supposed to exist, period. You know, never mind whether it's something that a faction created. If it was created, whilst it has anomalous effects, it is not considered to be an anomaly. Whereas anomalies are literally something that just suddenly blinks into existence in its natural state, violates the laws of reality and nature, whatever those laws may end up being. And as a result, this is considered to be an anomaly. Now, technically, Legend was born. He has a mother, he has a father. He doesn't remember either of them, which I'm not surprised, given how long he's lived. But He was born like a normal person, so how can he be anomalous? Well, again, nobody really has an exact explanation as to why. When it comes to Shattered Legacies, there are a lot of details like that, where it's like, why is this like this? Well, the fact of the matter is that we don't know. There's a lot of mystery. It's not that I don't have a reason for it, or I don't have lore for it. It's that in universe, there is just no reason. It just is the way that it is. There is always going to be mystery around it because nobody has identified why. Such as the workings of the devices and machines that the Techno-Jackson created. As of currently, there is nobody intelligent enough that can definitively say, this is how this specific thing functions. And as a result, the only person who knows is the Techno-Jackson, but the Techno-Jackson isn't coming back to life. He's dead. And as a result, it's just unknown. We don't know how it functions. We understand some of the base principles behind how it functions, but how it actually does it, we don't know. Can we replicate it? Yeah, we can replicate it, but we don't know how it functions. We don't know how it works. It's kind of like a comparison in Warhammer 40k. The Adeptus Mechanicus and the Titans. They can make new ones. Or they can make new ones so long as they have an STC, which is a standard... What is it? No. STC, I think. Standard template concept or something. I don't remember exactly what it is. But basically is a blueprint that they have, and this is how they create something. But the Mechanicus themselves are essentially mechanics. They can make modifications to it. They can keep it running and repair it, but they couldn't necessarily make it from scratch. And the problem with the Techno-Jackson technology is that when the Siritan Empire gets to the point where they start using technology created by the Techno-Jackson, they already have machines that are pre-made that can make the unidentifiable processes that occur. Because these machines are held within realitorial anchor zones. We talked about this. These are basically fixed locations in reality that when a creation cycle happens, they persist even after reality has been annihilated. And they're largely unaffected by the wider reality around them. And so as a result, these devices are always held in these realitorial anchor zones, and then when the Siritan Empire gets to the point where they start using Techno-Jackson tech, it's because they found a realitorial anchor zone that had one of the machines that does this insane, bizarre, unidentifiable, questionable science that violates the laws of reality. So, yeah. Another comparison is like Solstite. We don't know how Solstite functions. Why don't we know? Well, it was largely only the CEOs of Sol Tech Conglomerate, the original ones, that actually knew how to make it. And they died off. They didn't leave behind blueprints. We have machines that can create Solstite, which are, ironically enough, now owned by a different version of Sol Tech Conglomerate. But again, we don't know how they function. They're stored within realitorial anchor zones that only Sol Tech Conglomerate has access to. But we don't know how it functions, because only the original CEOs knew how it worked. And they didn't leave behind any explanation, and if they did, the current CEOs aren't telling anybody. So yeah, any time that I say, we don't know, it's because of that type of situation. They literally just do not know in universe. Now, I could spin some bullshit that is like, oh, it works because of this and this and this, and this is how it functions. But then it kind of takes away on the mystery of it, How is Solstite made? All we know is that's potentially dubious, but they're like, make it anyway. And it's like, you can kind of just sit there and be like, I wonder how they do make it, But if I reveal how it's done, which I technically do know how Solstite is made, it kind of spoils it, because it's like, oh, that's how? Okay. Well, either that's incredibly underwhelming, or that's not how I thought it was going to be, It allows this sort of idea of headcanon. What do you think it is? What do you think the reason is in your own mind? Now, for you, that's how it's made. That might not be how it's actually made, but I'm never going to say how it's actually made, because then it adds in a little bit of community involvement. You guys get to theorize. You guys get to say, maybe it's like this. And then the majority of the community may be like, yeah, I agree with that, you know? And then there are other things, like Tenjai Kuroga and the ways that it functions, that nobody literally has any idea how the fuck it works, because, yeah. But, so, another achievement that Legend did is probably one of the biggest ones is his battle with Zera. Now, in the next episode, I guarantee we're going to be going over Zera and the war between Zera and Zack Jackson. But, basically, Legend was the one who finally put down Zera. And I'm not going to go into every single detail, because some of those details require their own individual deep dives separate from the Zera and Zack episode that we're going to do next week. But, yeah, assuming that I remember that we're doing Zera next week. Another big achievement was the Nightmare Child. This was the first instance in which time and reality was kind of breaking down, was because of the Weavers of Reality constantly resetting reality, which is why they don't exist anymore, because they killed themselves off doing this. Legend had officially managed to take down the Nightmare Child. There was obviously his battle with Zera. There is perhaps one of the most important ones, because it threatened a lot of people, was the battle with the Void Dragon. Now, we haven't really gone over this topic in specific, and we'll probably do it in a different episode, largely because this one's already been going on for a while. The concept of infinity dragons. Now, dragons are semi-important within Shattered Legacies, because, let's face it, dragons are cool. There's no other reason beyond that. And there are various different types of dragons. We've talked about a few of them. I think we've talked about a few of them. But the biggest ones are the infinity dragons, and there's 5 in total, technically 4. These being Vega, the infinity dragon of desolation, Leo Lavania, the infinity dragon of the ever-burning flame, Gaira, the infinity dragon of life, death, and recreation, and the infinity dragon of the void, which has no name, and if it has one, only Gaira is aware of it and isn't telling anybody. Finally, there is technically the 5th one, although it comes very late and is almost never really shown in Shattered Legacies, which is Hyperion, the king of infinity dragons. But so, there are 2 of these infinity dragons that are held by very specific individuals. I believe in his deep dive we talked about Leo Lavania. We might not have. How Duran has access to Leo Lavania. And basically he can undertake a temporary transformation, as well as maybe even a more permanent one that takes on the powers of Leo Lavania into himself. The other one is Vega, who Legend has access to. And once again, it's similar to Duran, how he has a semi-temporary transformation that he can undertake. And it basically just supercharges him to an incredible degree. And he's more likely to use the power of Vega before he's likely to use just Tenjai on its own. So, but again, we'll probably go over the Infinity Dragons at a later date. But so, when it comes to Legend, and this is probably going to be one of the last things we talk about, when it comes to Legend, the way that he fights is very, very unique. You know? Like, every single melee weapon has a specific way that you use it, which is considered to be, you know, maybe one of the more efficient ways, like katanas, for example. There are various different schools of how you use a katana, you know? And as a result, if you know the school that they're using, you can kind of know how they are, choreographed, I think? You know how they're going to use that blade, because it's how that school trained them to use it. And it's very similar in Shattered Legacies, you know? Every single weapon has either one or multiple different ways in which you can optimally use it. And Legend is unique in that his method or his style of combat is literally complete and utter randomness. There is no rhyme or reason, there is no flow or rhythm whatsoever to how Legend fights. And as a result, this causes a lot of problems for his enemies. Like, there will be times where he's obviously supposed to block, he's about to get hit, but he'll go in for a killing blow. There are other times where he'll go in for a killing blow, but then he'll always feint or just intentionally miss. His combat style is literally complete and utter chaos and randomness. And it makes it very difficult to fight him because, especially when he has access to Tenjai Kuroga, the Whip Blade transformation, because he can literally just lash out at unexpected points or completely expected or lash out in completely unexpected times or at completely expected times. And it makes him a real pain in the ass to fight. Now, Legend himself is largely based off of my own personality, with a lot of differences between me and Legend. But one thing in note is that when it comes to me personally, I am obsessed with magic. I love magic in every single form, whether it be magic that is just like, there are no rules, it's just absurdly overpowered for the sake of being overpowered, to magic systems that are very specific and adds in for a lot of various different clever ways of using said magic, you know? And I love the concept of magic in general. Legend, on the other hand, absolutely fucking hates magic. When Legend fights, he uses two vital essences. That is physical strength and the power of divinity. He doesn't use psionics. He can't use psionics. And whilst he does have access to magic and he's fairly powerful with magic, he just abhors it and refuses to use it. So as a result, it's a lot of... You can basically think of divinity as divine miracles mixed with the energy blasts of Dragon Ball Z. That's basically what divinity is. You know, so it's a lot of energy beams that can't be categorized as magic, as well as just pure physical prowess is how he fights. But so yeah, I don't think we're quite at an hour, but that's honestly fine with me, because there's not really that much else I can think of at this moment. There'll obviously be more details. There'll be a lot of details that we'll be covering in our next episode, our Zera deep dive, which will also be the conflict between those two. But so yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. I do apologize for the hiatus that I kind of took there, but I was kind of getting burned out. But we're back officially this time. We're back. We're better than ever. We're ready. We're refreshed. So I hope you enjoy today's episode, and I hope you guys are looking forward to tomorrow's episode of Modded Survival, as well as Fridays. And then finally, we'll be right back at it Saturday and Sunday with our Saturday RimWorld live stream at noon Central Standard Time, and our Sunday night live stream at, once again, noon Central Standard Time. Coming right back here next Tuesday with our Zera versus Zack Jackson deep dive. Or, well, Zera deep dive with Zera versus Zack Jackson. So, until then, guys, see ya.